All right, greetings everyone. You are watching this on Tuesday, April 19th, 2002, and that's because I can't be in class today. Life happens sometimes. I got to take Sailor to the dentist today, but I'm making this video so that you can hear my voice, you can hear me teach it to you. Here's what I would recommend to you. For the substitute in the room, my battle buddy, my co-teachers, and the students, play this video on the big screen, volume as good as as high as it can go. Check the volume on YouTube, check the volume on the TV. And then students, you can be on the Chromebook and you can follow along with the slides that have been posted. It's been a pretty good method for us. You're able to see me, you're able to hear me talk, see it on the screen. Some of you can ride along with that, but also it's right in front of you, so that doesn't have to be like, oh, go back, like you guys do sometimes. So it's just right in front of you. You can follow along in the notes that you have in front of you, but you can also hear me teach it, elaborate, tell some stories along the way as well. What we won't be able to have today is the back and forth, the conversation that makes our class so rich. But what I'm going to be able to do is just kind of nail some terms for you, explain some things along the way. And then, of course, my co-teachers in the room, battle buddies, can help elaborate as much as necessary. So I also want to say that this, as I do this video here, we're going to have a couple more of these coming up as well. You guys know that next week I'll be at Army National Guard drill. So I'm going to use this method again. So just kind of, it's going to be my pit of the semester, right? We play peek or pit a lot. This week is definitely going to be my pit of the semester, being out of the classroom. But obviously I have a second job and it's something I got to go train at Fort Stewart for a week. So I'm going to do the best I can to continue to bring you that teaching, that education via the video. And you're just going to have to, you're going to have to lean forward. You're going to have to want to embrace the learning. You're going to have to take some responsibility for it on your own as well. Some personal responsibility for your own learning vocab. Don't just blast through the base level single sentence that may come up with the actual definition for a vocab term. Don't just stop at that smallest, simplest, basest level. Really try to unpack it. Okay. If I post an extra article or video, dive into that as well. You maximize your use of time in class. Don't just get through this 35-minute video and call it quits. Want to learn more. Sorry, I can't be there personally to kind of have these conversations with you, but I believe in you, students, my U.S. historians. You are going to be able to embrace this learning no matter what. So let's get to it. This day in history, a lot of times we like to think about what happened on this day in the past, and this is a pretty important and special one to me personally. April 19th, 1995 was the day that the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City was attacked by the American terrorist Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bombing, commonly referred to as the Oklahoma City bombing. I've told you my story before, and I'm not going to get to it at length right now, but I was a first grader. My father, he was 2 blocks south of the building, and he was affected by the blast. My mom heard it on the phone because she was on the phone with him at the time. And it's been a big part of our family's personal story ever since then. So this is the 27th anniversary of that event. Happened in the heartland of America. This is not some foreign battlefield. This is something that happened in Oklahoma City. See the t-shirt I'm wearing here, it says Oklahoma Standard. And as I explained to you last year when I was able to teach this to you on the anniversary date as well, the Oklahoma City response, the response to the event that happened in Oklahoma City became known as the Oklahoma Standard. The way Oklahomans rallied around each other, the way the country rallied around Oklahoma really set a standard for disaster relief and disaster response, and still used in the disaster relief industry to this day. Obviously, quite unfortunately, in 2001, the country had to rally again in New York City. But the Oklahoma Standard is the phrase that is used for how to respond to hard times and how to bounce back from those hard times. So I could go on and on and on. It's very near and dear to my heart personally. And, should you have any questions, or I will post a link about the Oklahoma City bombing. You can do some additional research on your own. What I won't be wearing in class on this day, but I have an Oklahoma City Fire Department hat. This is a replica, but this is the logo that really stood out to me as a first grader. This was the symbol of response. These were the good guys, Oklahoma City Fire Department. So I'll let President Reagan rest that right on top of his head there. And then I actually have, this is a piece of granite from the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. This is the building that was blown up, and this is a piece of it that my dad was able to get due to his proximity to the building at that time. And I'll leave that on the desk right here, and you guys can look at it, touch it, just kind of connect with that artifact from history if you wish. A lot of iconic photographs that come out of that day. I would wish for us to always remember the human cost, not just kind of approaching it from a historical perspective or something to be memorized or something that's in a textbook, but there was 168 people who died on that day, men, women, and children, to include members of the military and even one nurse who was responding at the scene. So 168 deaths on that day. Each one of them has a story. Each one of them is a person, a life that was snuffed out. So let's never just leave it at the history. Let's always remember that real people were impacted and affected as well. Okay, let's get to it. So yesterday we opened up the world. We opened up the Cold War. We talked about the Cold War presidents, and as you look at the president's wall to my left, your right. I hope I'm pointing at the right direction for the screen. You will see our wall of presidents, and we're going to refer to these 8 gentlemen as the Cold War presidents. That is Truman through Reagan, and then we're going to refer to the next 6. George H.W. Bush, all the way through President Biden. We're going to refer to them as presidents of the modern era. Now, our class will stop with President Obama. However, I am going to give you some information on Presidents Trump and Biden because, well, that's just the U.S. history that is nearest and dearest to us right now. So presidents of the Cold War era, presidents of the modern era, and a lot of information about each of them still coming at you. Got to be leaning into the learning. We still got a lot to go. Yesterday, we talked about containment and containment in action. We talked about the Korean War. And in fact, I passed around this piece of barbed wire that comes from the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. This is still up on the desk as well. I always encourage you to look at my artifacts carefully and respectfully. So that's right there for you to look at. Well, today we're going to look at some more containment in action in Vietnam, the Vietnam War. I'll remind you of this domino effect. Actually, President Eisenhower outlined this domino theory of containment. The idea was that if China fell to communism, then Korea would fall, then Vietnam would fall, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Burma, and India, the boom, 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 domino effect, domino theory of containment. So this is why U.S. forces went into Korea. This is why U.S. forces and U.S. diplomacy and U.S. time, money, and treasure will be spent in Vietnam. This idea of containment. So no splash zone today. Everybody's safe. I'm on a screen. I can't throw any water at you, but maybe you remember the idea of containment from yesterday. So a couple terms to know for today's class. We're going to talk about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the Tet Offensive and Vietnamization. Each of these are vocab words on the page in front of you. This would be a good starting definition, but I am going to elaborate pretty significantly along the way. So let's go. Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So this is an event that actually draws the United States into the Vietnam War. United States naval unit, beat Navy. United States Navy was in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin is in North Vietnam. We've always talked about how water is life, how water is commerce. Water is very significant. Well, a Gulf is a port, leads to port cities. Gulf of Tonkin, pretty significant location. The Navy forces here were supporting the South Vietnamese as they were raiding into North Vietnam. So that same situation where we're not putting troops into the fight just yet, but we're going to support along the way with equipment and money, maybe even some help from afar. We don't have boots on the ground, but we are supporting the fight because we don't want Vietnam to fall to communism. You can make a modern comparison to Russia and Ukraine today. We've done that all semester long. Same idea. We have provided a lot of assistance to Ukraine, but no boots on the ground. So here we find ourselves in a similar situation. Well, on August 2nd, 1964, the North Vietnamese are accused of attacking and destroying 2 U.S. Navy vessels, 2 U.S. Navy ships. The type of ship is called a destroyer. So we have 2 U.S. Navy ships that are bombed, that are attacked. Now, sometimes the history gets muddled. Was it an ammunition explosion from inside the ship? Was it a direct attack from the North Vietnamese? Irregardless, how do we phrase these type of situations? Well, do you remember the Maine? Do you remember the Lusitania? Yeah, of course. We're going to blame our enemy. We don't really say remember the Gulf of Tonkin. That's not one that caught on, but it's a very similar idea. Our Navy ships exploded. There is an explosion, and President Johnson uses this he responds by ordering attacks into North Vietnam on military targets. Okay, so you could say it's a proportional attack. They attacked a military target. We respond by attacking a military target. And from this, President Johnson requests and receives Congress approval to do so. That's significant. His first response has congressional approval. This is Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. He's doing much like I do with my pointer stick, right? And he is using a map to point out where the Gulf of Tonkin is, what exactly happened there. Got to paint the picture to the U.S. public. They're not exactly familiar with what's going on way over in Southeast Asia. So that's what Secretary of Defense McNamara is doing there. Well, from this request, President Johnson's request, Congress issues the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This is a vocab word. You need to write this down. The words in green are a pretty good definition. Gulf of Tonkin resolution gives the president authorization to conduct military operations in Southeast Asia without a declaration of war. We can use our military without a declaration of war. So here again, we are acting as the world police, a global cop. So this is a marked change in policy, right? Precedent breaking, if you will. George Washington says, don't get involved in foreign entanglements. President Lyndon Johnson makes a marked change in U.S. policy by placing U.S. ground troops into combat in South Vietnam. Now, this is actually the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. I don't expect you to read all those words, but what I want to point out to you is where my Mickey finger is pointing. Take a look there, and you'll see an open space in the document. And what should have gone there, what didn't go there, was an expiration date. There is no end to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Congress didn't say you can use troops for 60 days. You can use troops till the end of the year, December 31st. You can use troops for 3 years, right? Congress did not give a limitation to it. The expiration date is open. Big mistake. And because of this, we're going to find ourselves entangled in a very long and unending, seemingly unending war in Vietnam. So take note of that. There's literally no expiration date. Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So from this, the U.S. troop strength gradually grows to more than 500,000. That's 500,000 men in 1968. Gulf of Tonkin, 1964. 4 years later, there was 500,000 people in Vietnam. Now, you could backtrack even further than that. There were individual advisors to Vietnam. There were special forces teams advising the guerrilla fighters of South Vietnam, really as far back as 1955. So the picture you'll see on your screen, picture you'll see on your Chromebook says 1955 to 1975. That first decade or so, 1955 to 1964, very few troops being involved, kind of individual advisors, 10-person, 12-person special forces teams. But from 64 to 68, we have a strong ramp up. The number of troops on the ground rises to 500,000. The growth of the U.S. military influence in the region leads to the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, both of them communists, to give North Vietnam military aid. So we talked about a proxy war. Well, we're expressing our political ideologies, capitalism versus communism, in South Vietnam through the South Vietnamese, that's our side, the U.S. side, or the North Vietnamese, that's the communist side. Here's a nice little definition for the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The U.S. military got involved in Vietnam at the request of South Vietnam to protect them from a communist takeover of North Vietnam. Pretty important to understand. Take yourself back just to yesterday, where pretty much the same setup as in Korea. North Vietnam was communist-backed and supported. South Vietnam was U.S.-backed and supported. So we have really an identical setup. You don't have to rememorize anything. North, communist, South, capitalist, U.S.-backed. So Vietnam War, here we go here. Communist North versus the Democratic South. Ho Chi Minh, he is a big name in the on the communist side. Ho Chi Minh, and he is a fighter on the side of the North Vietnam. He is a communist fighter, and he's been a long-time fighter in Vietnam. He fought against the Brits. He fought against the French, right? We don't even get into that type of history, but Vietnam has been a battleground for a very long time. Ho Chi Minh doesn't think anything about now having to fight against the Americans. The style of fighting that marks the Vietnam War is guerrilla warfare. The run, hide, fight, shoot behind the trees, disappear into the jungle. Take it all the way back to the American Revolution. We said that the Patriots utilized this guerrilla warfare tactics to their advantage, whereas the British were marching in the open fields to their demise. Well, the Vietnam War and the jungle lends itself to these guerrilla warfare tactics. You don't really have uniformed armies. The Viet Cong fighters, they got nicknamed Viet Cong. Viet Cong fighters did not have to wear a uniform that had a rank on it or that said they were the enemy. They could just wear regular clothes. They could shoot and then blend back into the population. They could set booby traps and not even be present to see them go off. So it's very difficult circumstances for the United States to try to enter this foreign land and fight in the jungle. We talked about home field advantage in the American Revolution. That's why the Patriots were able to win. Well, we find ourselves on the opposite side of history here. Do not have home field advantage because we don't know anything about the jungles of Vietnam. A couple pictures along the way here, obviously demonstrating how difficult, how thick the jungle was. Literally the rainforest. Guys would make progress of just dozens of yards across an hour. It's not like you were going on a 10-mile hike and you're going to get there in an hour. No, you make the progress of maybe a football field in an hour inside of a thick jungle canopy like that. Lots of rain, that's the geography of the area. So lots of sandbags. You don't very often think about U.S. troops taking their shirt off and looking really unkempt like that. But that's kind of a hallmark of the Vietnam War. Is there's a lot of indiscipline going on, to say the least. Here is a tank that was bogged down and actually just stayed where it died. The Marines brought their tanks. Hey, it worked in World War II. It's going to work again, right? This is how we know how to fight. We know how to fight by using our technology, right? The Americans brought technology, but technology is not always useful. Just because it's technologically advanced doesn't make it useful in every environment. The guerrillas knew the land. The guerrillas had a reason to fight. Tanks were not going to work out in the jungle in this fashion. And, well, I don't know if this tank is a tourist attraction or people go and take their picture with it to this day, but there it sits in the jungles of Vietnam. Another way that the guerrillas could fight, I mentioned how they know the land. They had a very extensive tunnel network. These guerrilla fighters who had been fighting for decades had used all that time, all those decades, to dig underneath the ground and set up a very extensive tunnel network, not all different from the trench systems of World War I, except these were underground. So many of these guerrilla fighters were able to just pop up, shoot, and then literally disappear underground. Take note of this guy right here. He's physically smaller than you might expect for a good fighter. See, we have this very American stereotype that muscular, an MMA type fighter, like totally yoked dude, and from a guy that's just got big old muscles from the weight room. That's what makes a good fighter, right? That's what makes a good soldier. Well, in Vietnam, these people are literally physically smaller. Genetically speaking, they are a smaller type of person. And as such, their smallness, their diminutiveness, there's a SAT word for you, worked to their advantage. These tunnels were small. They were skinny. Like, just take a look at that and you can see that the breadth of his shoulders, I probably couldn't fit in there. My shoulders are broader than that hole is. But this guy, small though he be, could navigate these tunnels, pop up, shoot, pop down. Very frustrating to American forces on patrol. They never even saw the enemy that was fighting them. A little bit more about the tunnel system here. This tunnel network exists to this day. This is a more modern picture. You can see the guy's got kind of a plaid t-shirt on, a plaid long sleeve shirt on. So this is not from the war. These tunnel systems exist still to this day. And this is an example of that as well. One more picture here. This is a museum type setup, but just like Americans have museums, the Vietnamese have set up a museum here. You see the mannequins demonstrating what the tunnel system might have looked like. And the tunnels were so cut out that the headquarters officers could even set up their command posts and their tables and spread out their maps, or really even just sit down for tea. That's a teapot right there, right? This is how extensive these tunnel systems were. A little bit more on that, kind of make a pop culture reference for you. If you watch the movie Forrest Gump, get to the scenes about Forrest being in Vietnam, and Forrest is tagged to be a so-called tunnel rat. Sometimes the smaller American troops, those who would be able to fit into holes and tunnels like this, they would be called, they'd be given the duty of going in head first, trying to clear out the tunnel. And if you remember a specific scene from Forrest Gump, I'll try to find a YouTube video and link it for you. Forrest, now he's a character, I know it's fictional, but it very much represents what happened in Vietnam. Forrest was given a handgun, not a rifle. Rifle would be too big, too long to take into these tunnels. Forrest is given a handgun, and he goes in head first, holds a flashlight with a bit of a reverse grip, holds his handgun like this, and he goes into the tunnel head first to clear it out. And with his flashlight and with his pistol, his objective would be to shoot the first thing he saw, right? He wasn't discriminating friend from foe. If you were in the tunnel, you were the Vietnamese, you were the Viet Cong, you were the enemy. So these many American soldiers, the smaller ones, were called tunnel rats and cleared out tunnels in that fashion. I'll drop a YouTube link in our Google Classroom and you can check out that scene. Again, fictional, being Forrest Gump, but a very true idea for how the Americans had to fight this war. Totally different than the big land battles of Europe in World War II. Totally different than the island hopping campaigns of the Pacific theater of World War II. Is a brand new style of fighting. So it doesn't matter how much experience the United States military had in recent years, how much experience their generals had. It's a brand new style of fighting, and that brand new style of fighting was going to bring a lot of trouble to the military. One more thing, one more style of fighting that the Viet Cong were good at, they were able to set up booby traps. They knew the land. They've been doing this for decades, first against the British, then against the French. Well, now they're just going to do the same thing against the Americans. Take a real close look in this photo here. I know it's kind of dark on my screen. I'll go to this one. This is called a punji stick pit. Very harsh tactic, very frustrating tactic to the Americans. Here's how it worked. So you can see that it's a bit of a dig out into the ground. Well, there would be a false ceiling laid over this punji stick pit. Maybe some brush, some longer leaves, and just some straw thrown up over it. And then when a soldier, a 200-pound person like myself, would step onto the punji pit, well, that ceiling would collapse, right? It was never intended to hold weight. It would collapse, and can you see what's below? A bunch of sharpened bamboo sticks, okay? Literally a booby trap that was designed to actually not kill you. It was designed to wound you. Because in the deep jungles of Vietnam, a dead soldier very often may just be left in place, or a dead soldier could just be carried out to the rear, and obviously you deal with the casualty, you deal with the dead person. But a wounded soldier actually took more time and resources trying to keep them alive, trying to speed them to the rear for medical attention. Dead soldiers were a little bit easier to deal with than wounded soldiers. So the Viet Cong actually intended to wound as many soldiers as possible. And these types of booby traps was a way to do that. One more little side extra for you. I know you're going to make your ooh face here in just a second. Sometimes these punji sticks were poisoned on the tip. You could use a variety of plant or animal chemicals to poison the tip of them. Sometimes they take a so-called poison dart frog and kind of use the poison juices, the venom of that frog, maybe venom from a snake, maybe a poisonous snake. But in a pinch, you know what you could do? You could use some human fecal matter. That's right, poop. They would smear poop onto the tip of these punji sticks. I'm just imagining some of y'all making that ooh face right now. Reason for that is the bacteria that is in fecal matter. If it is, if you get a gash, you get a cut as you fall into the punji stick and goes into your side, well, now you have that bacteria jammed into your body as well, and that can create infection and make the wound a whole lot worse. So a very brutal, harsh, and frustrating tactic for the military, the Americans to be using in the jungle. A little bit more here. So hallmarks of the Vietnam War, Americans were very often accused of attacking civilians. It's very hard to tell who was the enemy when they didn't wear a uniform. Americans used a variety of bombs, different sizes, sometimes chemicals to clear out the foliage, to clear out the actual vegetation, but those chemicals would have a very long-lasting effect. Napalm was an explosive, a gelatin type of explosive. Agent Orange was a herbicide, but it had very long-lasting impact, not a safe herbicide at all, and just a variety of other atrocities. Mass killings inside of villages, women and children, non-military aged men. Very hard time for the United States military, and we don't have time to get into all those individual stories. You could spend a lifetime studying the Vietnam War, and you have a whole course on the war in Vietnam, as you could on many of our topics, but we got to move right along. So I'm going to tell you about now one big battle in the Vietnam War. It's actually a lengthy series of battles. It's called the Tet Offensive. Start to pay attention to the year 1968. We're going to talk about 1968 several times in the coming days, and 1968 is going to be a very landmark year for America, both at home and abroad, especially here in Vietnam. So 1968 the fighting begins with the Tet Offensive. Now, Tet is the most important holiday in Vietnam. Vietnam is largely a Buddhist country, and the Buddhist calendar recognizes Tet as a New Year celebration. So the Tet is basically basically a Buddhist Vietnamese New Year's celebration, and it is the most important holiday in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive was a coordinated series of North Vietnamese attacks on more than 100 cities or forts, outposts in South Vietnam. Very significant to this was that the carnage, the death and destruction of these attacks was shown on television. And for the first time, Americans started to pay attention to what was coming across their television screens and starting to see that, oh, there's a bad thing going on in Vietnam. And obviously that's going to start to turn public opinion against the war. It decreases against the war at home. And a little bit more here. So here's a map showing the Tet Offensive. The red arrow indicates the North Vietnamese attacking across the borders of Cambodia and Laos. What's really difficult about this for the Americans is that we're fighting in Vietnam. The Americans are not allowed to position themselves across the border in Cambodia and Laos. Well, the enemy doesn't exactly follow those same rules. The enemy stages across the border to the east in Laos and Cambodia and then attacks into Vietnam. And then they can escape right across the border back to Laos or Cambodia, and the Americans are technically not allowed to pursue them across the border. So this is the setup for the Tet Offensive. The attacks are coming from across the border. Not much that the Americans can do to prevent it. Now, what we could have done a little bit better is have been prepared. The attitude was that the North Vietnamese were going to take a tactical pause to celebrate Tet. When in fact, what they did was the old George Washington, and they attacked essentially on Christmas night. Now, just like George Washington crossed the frozen Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, he did not say, let's celebrate Christmas. He said, let's push forward, men, and attack on Christmas night. Very similar to what the North Vietnamese did here. So maybe the American military should have remembered what our own father of our country did. He attacked on Christmas night, and maybe we should have been more prepared for an attack that would come on a holiday. And the North Vietnamese basically did exactly that. They did not pause for the holiday. They attacked on the holiday, and the Americans kind of got caught with their guard down. A little bit more here. U.S. forces, being as it was, many different attacks. It wasn't just one big battle. It was many different attacks, 100 different cities and outposts. U.S. forces were unable to totally destroy the communist forces in South Vietnam, and the communist forces lacked the ability to drive out the Americans. Leads to a stalemate. Right, we're just kind of pushing back and forth against each other, much like in the Korean War. It's a little bit of a movement to the north to the south, to the north to the south, and it stops at the 38th parallel. Same idea here. The Americans are unable to defeat the communists. The communists are unable to defeat the Americans. So what we have ourselves here is a stalemate, just kind of a tie, if you will. But neither side willing to surrender. So the fighting continues with neither side making much progress. Something that happens inside the country at this time as well is inflated body counts that were a lie. For a long period of time, generals, politicians, the people in the White House press conference room, the message to the American public is that we're winning the war in Vietnam. Well, the Tet Offensive and it being shown on television starts to show that, in fact, we are not winning the war in Vietnam. And the images coming across the screen on a nightly basis, the casualty count, the names that would be scrolled on American television, that's not something that happens today. But on a nightly basis, the national news would list the names of those who had been killed in combat in the previous 24 hours. And Americans started to realize the toll that this involvement in Vietnam was having on ourselves as a country. These are sons and daughters and cousins and nephews, and there's women involved as well, so daughters and sisters. And the American public is starting to think, why are we over in that foreign country? Why don't we take care of the issues that we have at home first? So this is something pretty significant that the Tet Offensive starts to reveal. General William Westmoreland, he urges Congress to authorize an additional 200,000 men to finish off the North Vietnamese army once and for all. But do we want to send 200,000 more men when all we see are these grisly images coming across our screen on a nightly basis? Well, the plot twist here is that the communist forces were not on the verge of defeat. And very similar to what I just said to you, the North Vietnamese forces staged a massive offensive into the south in order to shatter the morale of the United States and South Vietnamese units. Initially caught off guard, the South Vietnamese forces and U.S. forces rallied to counterattack and inflict severe casualties on the Viet Cong. Televised scenes of heavy street fighting in Saigon and Hue played out in living rooms all across America on a nightly basis. So I read the slide to you to make sure you got it, similar to the things I've already said. Here's a couple of the images that started coming across the screen on a nightly basis. If you, I just kind of give you the blood and guts warning here. It's kind of some, a couple of grown-up images here. And if you don't care to see them, you may put your head down for a few seconds. This is a picture that made it on newspapers and televisions and magazines all across the country. Now, the soldier there with the gun, he's actually South Vietnamese. And of course, that's the side we're supporting. But what he's doing is he's executing a man openly in the streets. And this man is accused of being a North Vietnamese sympathizer. In fact, this man is accused of having murdered a colonel, a South Vietnamese colonel earlier in the day. So is he the enemy? Yes, perhaps. But are we for executions in the middle of the street without due justice and a trial by jury and all that kind of stuff? That's against the American ideal. I'll show you the colorized version here. It's pretty powerful. So this is an image that kind of gripped the conscience of many of Americans and made us wonder, what are we doing? Is this the right thing? Are we supporting the right guys? Why are we sending our sons and daughters to die over in this this country called Vietnam? This is a picture of Americans watching the Vietnam War unfold on their television screens, and kind of at an angle, but you can see that they are some grisly images. And mom and pop, he's coming off of his white collar job. Maybe he's he obviously is in a shirt and a tie, so he's not getting his hands dirty quite like the way the boys in Vietnam are. But he has to wonder, why in the world is my country involved in these type of things that I'm seeing on my screen right now? Next picture here, a really famous photograph. This was on the cover of, I believe, Time magazine. And these boys are retreating out of the city. They've really been beaten in battle. We don't like to think that Americans lose in battle, but these boys have kind of been beaten in battle. And well, before email and social media and the speed of communication that we have today, these young men would not have been able to just phone home, tell their parents, "Hey, I'm fine," or the casualties, I got hurt, but I'm in a hospital. A lot of American families found out the fate of their children by seeing photographs that came across the nightly news or were in a magazine when the magazines were published. So just imagine opening up a magazine or seeing it on the cover, and that's your son, or that's your cousin, or that's your nephew, or that's your neighbor from down the street. Young man graduated high school and he immediately got drafted into service. And all of a sudden, the next time you see him is on the cover of the magazine, bloodied, battered, beaten like that. Suffice it to say, support for the war at the home was not very high. Another thing I didn't quite get into yet, but I will. I should mention is the draft, compulsory service. Many of the young men who are fighting, maybe those who are in this image right here, did not volunteer for service. Today, the military is all volunteers. I volunteered to go to the academy, and of course, I choose to serve. Very frequently, we have the military recruiters come to the lunchroom, and they're trying to inspire you to want to serve. They're telling you the benefits of service, and yes, signing up to get your college paid for is maybe a big perk, but you are volunteering to serve. Many of these young men did not get the chance to volunteer. They were told to serve. And the way the draft worked was based off of someone's birthday. So they would pick literally just a lottery. They'd pick a number out of a bowl, and let's say it's June 17th. Boom. Everybody born on June 17th who just turned 18 years old was drafted into service. It's a little more nuanced than that, but that's basically how it works. So imagine watching on national television, this lottery is happening, and they're drawing your birthday out of a bucket of numbers. And if your birthday gets called, that means you have to go serve in the war, whether you want to or not. It would be against the law. It'd be breaking the law to try to get out of your service. Now, many people did. People fled to Canada. Many people burned their draft cards as if to say, you can't tell me what to do, government. You can't tell me what to do, Uncle Sam. And then many people were jailed for avoiding their service. They were convicted and had consequences, had punishment because they avoided service. So this was not voluntary service. It was called compulsory service via the draft. So that's another thing that was leading to a discontent at home. It was not people who were willing to go to war, but our country was telling you will go to war. That is called the draft. This next slide here, and this pretty powerful quote, this comes from a very respected newsman, Walter Cronkite. And like a good newsman, he went to where the story was, right? He didn't just stay at home. He didn't just see the images unfold on a screen. He went to where the story was. You can see he's wearing a bulletproof flak vest. He's wearing a helmet. He is on the front lines. He is getting the story from the men who are fighting the war. And as a respected voice in the news, many Americans listened to him. Many Americans respected his opinion and his observations. And what Walter Cronkite says is, it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. So this analysis by Walter Cronkite is kind of very condemning of the war effort in Vietnam, and the public sentiment at home definitely tilts towards the negative because of this whole series of events. A little bit more on Tet Offensive. The United States government had said that the war was nearing victory, but it became clear that it was not as close to ending as officials said, evidenced by the extreme force demonstrated by the communist efforts in the Tet Offensive. It's had a big impact on the 1968 presidential election. There it is again, 1968. President Lyndon Johnson, the man you see on the screen there, actually chooses to not run. He could have run again. He had the eligibility to run for a second term, but he chose to not run. And I think this picture is very indicative of he was tired. You ever just rub your forehead when you're tired? He was tired. He was exhausted. He was war weary. So in choosing to not run for re-election in 1968, he opens the door to new candidates in the Democratic Party, his party, but also new candidate in the Republican Party, which is Richard Nixon, who is going to go on and win. So because of LBJ's decision, his nickname is LBJ, because of LBJ's decision to not run for re-election in 1968, we have a change in parties and a change in presidents, and Richard Nixon is going to greatly affect the end of the Vietnam War. Vietnam War at home, I kind of largely said a lot of this already. Many protests against the war, the draft, and bombing campaigns. There was violence at protests. And many protests were held on college campuses, very notably at Kent State University in the year 1970. What happened at Kent State, I'll give you the super brief version of it. There were students protesting against the war in Vietnam, against the draft, against the killing of innocent women and children, all the things that we've already talked about. And these university students started to get a little rowdy. So the university officials and the local government and all that, they call in the Ohio National Guard. Kent State University is located in Ohio. They call in the Ohio National Guard. Well, think about it. These students are protesting against the military. So now you got troops rolling up to try to calm down the protesters. What we have is a recipe for disaster. What happens, as we've read about in several different times already, shot heard around the world, Boston Massacre, and more. A shot rings out, many shots follow, and in the end, the aftermath is that several students were killed at home on their university grounds. American soldiers shooting American civilians in the United States. Not a good look for the military, not a good situation, not good for the overall feeling towards the military, towards the government, and towards the war effort at all. So that's the story of the Kent State shootings in 1970. Overall, all these contribute to make the war extremely, to say the least, extremely unpopular. Here is President Richard Nixon. Now it's the year 1973. Okay, he's actually into his second term in office. He wins in 68. He wins in 62. President Nixon, he seeks to reestablish positive relationship with the world and other world leaders. So he ends the war in Vietnam due to this goal and pressure from anti-war protests. Basically, the United States is getting a bad look all around the world for its ineptness in Vietnam, for its mass killings of women and children, for its widespread bombing campaigns. Nothing good is coming out of Vietnam. Have we contained communism? I don't even know if we can say we accomplished that goal. President Nixon says it's time to go. Okay, it's been long enough. It is time to go. I'm ending the war in Vietnam through a process called Vietnamization. And what you can see here is a chart, again, very similar to as I use charts to depict things to you. This man here is using a chart to show low number of troops. That's on the left-hand side of the chart. Peak number of troops, over 500,000, over 1 million. And then the goal is to draw down troops gradually, but pretty sharply as well, draw down troops in Vietnam as a way to get out. This is called Vietnamization, the U.S. policy of withdrawing troops from Vietnam and transferring the responsibility in the direction of the war effort to the government of South Vietnam. Basically, the idea was that it should become a civil war between North and South Vietnam. We're out. It didn't work. It's not helping us at home. North, South Vietnam, y'all figure it out. But the Americans are going to withdraw from their effort and their presence in Vietnam. I'll give you a real deal comparison and say that's exactly what I was involved in Afghanistan. My time in Afghanistan in the year 2012, 2013, we were very much focused on helping the Afghans prepare to lead on their own. We actually called it providing Afghan solutions to Afghan problems. Maybe the Americans could have fixed a certain problem a little bit faster, a little bit more efficiently, a little bit better, but the Americans need to leave Afghanistan. So my job was to train local police officers, police checkpoint officers, the local mayor, and we wanted to help the Afghans be prepared to lead as we left. So I understand Vietnamization because I was involved in a very similar process during my time in Afghanistan. A little bit more here. The actual peace treaty is called the Paris Peace Agreement. 1973, the White House convinces Saigon that they will not abandon them if they sign a peace accord. We won't leave you until we do. Open hostilities end between the U.S. and the North Vietnamese. Conflict continues as South Vietnamese battle the communists. Very small number of Americans remain in South Vietnam. And in 1975, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, falls, and Vietnam is united under communism. So we won't leave you until we do. And Vietnam, in the end, is gobbled up by communism. You could say that domino fell. 20 years of efforts, 20 years of containment did not work because to this day, Vietnam is a communist country. This is a picture of literally the last chopper out of Saigon. These are people climbing a ladder to try to get in it and get out. This is one of the last American choppers leaving the American embassy in Saigon, which is South Vietnam. And then this is a very harrowing picture. On the left-hand side, this is one of the last choppers out of Kabul, Afghanistan, presently, this past year. And then on the right-hand side, that's one of the last choppers, or very commonly called the last chopper out of Saigon. Very harrowing comparison to be made because they look very similar. The pictures look very similar. Moving on here, I've kind of given, here's the summary. Here's the Vietnam War summary. In Vietnam, the United States was gradually increasing its involvement in the region to contain communism. That was the goal, to contain communism. What began as military aid to the South Vietnamese gave way to military training, and eventually American forces engaged in combat with the communist fighters in the region. First, money. Second, a limited number of advisors and trainers. Third, large number of boots on the ground. So a very gradual progression up to that 500,000 service members in Vietnam. This was more involvement and more costly to the American public than the American public was willing to tolerate. So in the end, the number of people dying in Southeast Asia for who knows why was not something that the public could understand or would tolerate. Obviously, there's political ramifications there, and that is a big reason why we draw out of Vietnam. Picture you see on the screen there is the black hat. The words say Vietnam veteran, and I think I've given you my Veterans Day speech before. If you see a veteran in town wearing a black hat, whether it says Vietnam War, Korean War, even more recently, Afghanistan or Iraq War, and I've got my Afghanistan veteran hat just right over there, stop and ask them a question. Say thank you for your service. Thank you for your service is nice. But my challenge to you is, especially as these gentlemen get older, and as they get older, they start leaving the earth, right? Get a story out of them before they're not here anymore. They've got a lot of life lessons. They've got a lot of stories to tell. If they're wearing the hat, they're probably proud of their service or willing to talk about it. I completely understand many people don't want to talk about what they experienced in service, and you got to be sensitive to your relatives or neighbors or people who may not want to talk about their service, especially in Vietnam. But if someone's wearing that black hat, they're probably proud of what they did, or they're at least they've healed from the harm, from the difficulties they've experienced, and maybe just maybe they're willing to tell you a story. So I would encourage you to do this. Say thank you for your service. That's a nice thing to hear. As a veteran, I'll tell you that's a nice thing to hear. But don't just stop there. Say, can I buy you a cup of coffee? Can we sit down and chat? Can you tell me a life story? Can you give me a life lesson? I'd encourage you to get to know these people, whether they're your neighbors or your relatives or anything in between, and try to learn and grow from their stories. How does our country remember Vietnam to this day? This is the National Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. And on this wall is etched the names of more than 54,000 people who died in Vietnam. And they are not written in alphabetical order, but they're written in sequential order, the year that they died. And the shape of the wall actually kind of mirrors the shape of our troop involvement. The beginning of the war, listed in 1955, the wall is very low to the ground, it's very skinny, and it rises to the peak of the war. It's very tall, it's taller than me at that point, and then it starts to draw down again, and the names are written in the sequence of the years that these people died. If they died alongside each other in the same battle, in the same fight, if they were platoon mates from the same unit, the names are etched next to each other. It's a very beautiful, very powerful place to visit. It's very quiet, respectful, place for reflection, thinking, remembering. This is a pretty powerful piece of art. A lot of Vietnam veterans visit the wall to heal. And this is not a photograph, but a painting. And it shows a man decades after the war. He's got his hand placed on the wall, and it's almost like his friends are reaching back to him, helping him heal, remembering the stories they've been in together. Obviously, it's representation, it's art. So look at that, kind of think about what that says to you. I was able to visit last time I was in Washington, D.C. in January of 2021. And then one more little thing. This is probably my favorite single thing in Washington, D.C. It's not one of the big memorials. It's part of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, but it's just a little bit of a side to the extra. And this is a statue called the Three Soldiers. And the reason I love it so much is because I first saw it when I was in 7th grade. I visited Washington, D.C. in 7th grade. I remember this statue. At that time, I wanted to join the military as one of my life goals. So I was kind of drawn to the soldiers, thinking that that might be what I accomplish someday. Well, now, in this age, having experienced war in Afghanistan, having grown a lot as a person, when I go back and I visit this statue now, I see so many more details that I didn't notice the first time. And you really got to walk all the way around the statue. You got to get the 360. But I'll tell you what I see on this statue. One, I empathize with the stress that's on their face. I empathize with the emotions that you can see coming through the art. And you're like, it's a statue. How can you tell what emotions they're feeling? Having experienced it myself, I can tell what emotions they're feeling. I also love the representation that's in this statue. So the man in the middle, he's kind of a half step forward. I would guess that maybe he's the squad leader of the trio here. He's a white American, a Caucasian American. He represents a white American. The fella to his right, you can tell he has a bit of a hairstyle, represents African Americans. You can tell his features. He's an African American. So you got a white guy, you got a black guy, and then to the left, this individual represents a Hispanic American. You can tell he has some Hispanic features. And so what you have here is a representation of 3 different people, 3 different backgrounds, 3 different heritages, but on patrol in Vietnam, we're all the same. On patrol with our lives on the line, my brother to my left and my brother to my right. It did not matter what color he is, does not matter what his background is, does not matter how much his family has or doesn't have. We're on patrol in Vietnam together, and we got to work together to stay alive. We got to work together to come back home. So I think it's a really beautiful representation of sometimes the blending that happens in the military. There's an old phrase that we're all green in the Army. We don't see colors otherwise. We're just all green in the Army. And anyway, the 3 soldiers there, it's just a very beautiful statue. And should you ever find yourself in Washington, D.C., I would totally recommend taking a minute to pause and reflect at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. But you know what? You don't have to go to Vietnam to pause and reflect about service, because right here in Alma, we have a Veterans Pavilion as well. And these are not people who died in service. These are names of those who are from Alma and served. And I've told you about this several times before. And in fact, our recent Spring Break Bonus Points Challenge took some of you there to etch a name, much like people would etch names off of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall. Some of you etched the names of your friends and family and kin who are listed right here on the Veterans Wall of Honor right here in Alma, Georgia. So I would encourage you, I think you all know this is right next to Dairy Queen. Next time you're at Dairy Queen getting a meal or just getting a blizzard after a game or whatever the reason may be. Next time you're at Dairy Queen, park the car, get your food, get your ice cream, and why don't you walk on over to the Veterans Pavilion and just kind of think about the service that has come before you here in Alma as well. All right, moving on to there's just a couple of miscellaneous Vietnam War pictures, and I'm not going to explain too much. This is just kind of for you to pause and reflect. This picture right here, every black dot represents a bomb that was dropped in Vietnam, a U.S. bomb that was dropped in Vietnam. And I want you to look all the way even into the ocean. But also, just like I said earlier, we're only supposed to be fighting in Vietnam. Why don't you look into Laos and Cambodia and Thailand as well and see how convoluted the war became, right? Congress says you can fight in Southeast Asia, and well, the president takes that to heart and authorizes very widespread fighting and bombing campaigns. So this is pretty powerful, shows the cost of the war. Very iconic photo. The new tanks didn't work out. I said the Americans brought over their technology and the tanks got stuck in the mud. But a new piece of technology in the Vietnam War was the helicopter. A lot of times it was called the cavalry of the 1960s, right? It's the new cavalry, not horses, but helicopters. And soldiers would arrive to battle on helicopter. And this is a great example here of helicopters, many helicopters, a fleet of helicopters delivering a battalion of soldiers to the field of battle, and just a new technology. This picture here, these are American prisoners of war that were captured behind enemy lines and held, many of them in very difficult conditions. Many of them, just because you became a prisoner of war certainly didn't mean you were going to survive the war. Many Americans perished as prisoners of war. And this is a colorized photo, I believe. It was a very powerful photo of Americans being held captive in North Vietnam. And then these are two photos here that just represent the widespread protest to the Vietnam War overall. So Americans protesting the Vietnam War, both in Washington, D.C. and in Berkeley, Oakland, California. So the protests weren't only in the capital city. The protests were very widespread all the way across the country. Two movies here that very much represent Vietnam, and variety of movies you could dive into, but I think the seminal movies that represent the war in Vietnam, one, We Were Soldiers, with Mel Gibson, represents a true story about Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore. Started as a book, becomes a movie, a pretty accurate representation of the war in Vietnam. And then secondly, Oliver Stone's Platoon. You can see it's the 1986 winner of the Best Picture, winner of the Oscar for Best Picture. I love the tagline of this movie. It says, "The first casualty of war is innocence." Or as General William Tecumseh Sherman might say it with me, war is hell. Yeah, Platoon is not a true story, but it's a very representative story of both the fighting in Vietnam and the response to that fighting at home. It follows a character, Charlie Sheen, and his character's name is Chris Taylor, and it just kind of shows his story from becoming a soldier, his family's response to that, difficulties they have in the jungle, difficulties that are going on at home. So Platoon, not a true story, but very representative of the country at that time. And again, the tagline is, "The first casualty of war is innocence." And I agree. I'm going to pause this video here. That rounds out the war in Vietnam. And what we got next is the space race, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and President Kennedy's role in both of those. So pause for the time being. Why don't y'all take your bathroom break if you haven't already, and I'll catch you with the second video here in just a second.